What if I told you that before the United States became a nation, its land was home to cities larger than London, empires that rivaled those of Europe, and a world forever changed by a single voyage across the ocean? Before there were presidents, protests, or even pilgrims, there was a story already unfolding on this land, one of civilizations rising, cultures colliding, and a foundation laid in both promise and pain. This is the untold beginning, the first chapter in the story of America. Welcome to the Story of America, Part 1, Foundations from 1492 to 1776. Long before the first European ships appeared on the horizon, the American continents were already thriving with life and culture. From the ancestral Puebloans who carved entire cities into the cliffs of the Southwest to the Mississippian culture who built giant earthen mounds and complex trade networks across the Midwest, North America was anything but empty. In what is now Mexico, the Aztec Empire rose in splendor, building the vast city of Tenochtitlan on a lake. To the south, the Maya had already developed advanced mathematics and astronomy, and in the far Andes, the Inca controlled an empire stretching thousands of miles. In what would become the United States, diverse Native American nations thrived, from the Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast, a sophisticated alliance of tribes, to the nomadic Lakota of the Great Plains, to the agricultural tribes of the Southeast like the Cherokee and Creek. These were civilizations with languages, laws, religions, and trade routes, all flourishing for centuries. But everything would change in 1492. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, he unknowingly set off one of the most dramatic events in human history, what historians call the Columbian Exchange. Plants, animals, diseases, and ideas now flowed between the Old World and the New. Corn, potatoes, and tomatoes spread to Europe. Horses, pigs, and smallpox came to the Americas. But this exchange came at a devastating cost. In just a century, millions of indigenous people would die, not in battle, but from disease, starvation, and forced labor. In some areas, 90% of the population vanished. Spain led the early wave of colonization. Spanish conquistadors conquered the Aztecs and Incas, establishing vast colonies in Central and South America. But they weren't alone for long. The French, Dutch, and English soon followed, each seeking land, wealth, and power in the New World. The English were late to the game, but they would eventually dominate North America. In 1607, they founded Jamestown in Virginia, the first permanent English colony in what would become the U.S. It was a rough start. Starvation, disease, and conflict nearly wiped them out. But tobacco, grown by enslaved labor and indentured servants, saved the colony. Just over a decade later, in 1620, a group of religious separatists set sail aboard the Mayflower. We call them pilgrims. They landed in Massachusetts and signed the Mayflower Compact, an early form of self-government. More English colonies soon followed. Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, Quakers in Pennsylvania, debtors in Georgia, traders in New York. By the early 1700s, there were 13 colonies stretching along the Atlantic coast. These colonies were diverse in economy, religion, and culture, but they were all tied to Britain. And while they saw themselves as loyal subjects, they were also growing used to running things their own way. Life in colonial America was hard, but full of opportunity. In the north, rocky soil and cold winters led to small farms, shipbuilding, and commerce. Town meetings and Puritan values created tight-knit communities. The middle colonies, like Pennsylvania and New York, were melting pots. Dutch, German, English, and Swedish settlers mingled in diverse cities, farming fertile land and trading in busy ports. In the South, massive plantations grew rice, indigo, and especially tobacco. But that wealth came at a cost: the labor of enslaved Africans. Slavery had existed in the colonies since the early 1600s. By the 1700s, it was central to the Southern economy. Enslaved people lived under brutal conditions, their culture and humanity stripped, but not erased. Resistance, survival, and community would become their legacy. Meanwhile, Native Americans were being pushed westward. Treaties were made and broken. Wars erupted, like King Philip's War and the Yamasee War, as indigenous nations resisted colonial expansion. By the mid-1700s, the colonies were booming. The population was growing. Trade was thriving. But storm clouds were gathering. In 1754, Britain and France clashed in North America. The result was the French and Indian War, part of a global conflict known as the 7 Years' War. Britain won, but the war left them deeply in debt. To pay it off, they began taxing the colonies. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act. Colonists protested. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry. Britain cracked down. Tensions rose. The Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts. Colonists weren't just angry about taxes, they were angry about control, about being treated as subjects, not citizens. In 1774, colonial leaders gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They weren't calling for revolution, not yet, but the seeds were planted. Thinkers like Thomas Paine, John Locke, and Enlightenment philosophers inspired new ideas about liberty, rights, and the role of government. Could people govern themselves? Could a colony break free from an empire? In 1775, the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun. And on July 4, 1776, just 284 years after Columbus set sail, the colonies declared their independence. A new nation was born, but its story was only just beginning. This was just the foundation, the first chapter in a long, complex, and often painful journey. In part 2 of the story of America, we dive into the revolution itself. The war, the heroes, the betrayals, and the moment a fragile republic stepped into the world's stage. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe and join us as we continue the journey through the history of the United States.